Hey guys, welcome back to another episode of Bolt Breakdowns here on the Guilty as Charged podcast YouTube channel. Today, we are going to talk about best player available versus position of need. If you want a little background on this topic, you can just search Chargers BPA on Twitter, and you'll find plenty of debates about whether the Chargers should take Jalen Waddle or whether they should take Christian Darrisaw, and plenty of other draft combinations. But in short, best player available does mean that you were taking the most talented player, sometimes regardless of need, at a pick in the draft. And that has become a talking point at 13 with potentially players like Devonta Smith, potentially a player like Jalen Waddle being available at the selection. So, if you have someone graded higher than a need, then would you take a wide receiver at 13? That's a debate. So, and obviously position of need is kind of explanatory, right? You're taking a cornerback or offensive tackle because you need a cornerback or offensive tackle on the Chargers. Anyway, I wrote an article this week talking about why I think that wide receiver at pick 13 is kind of a fundamentally bad idea. And to just cover some of the key points, I talked about how the Chargers have a lot of significant needs where they don't have depth at these positions, and they do have a good amount of depth at wide receiver, even if you're not fully on the Mike Williams train. And so for me, I talked about Tom Telesco's draft history following the first round, which is quite honestly not as good as his, first round draft history. And anyway, this article got a lot of talk on Twitter. I talked about how wide receiver is the deepest position of this draft, and that's not just me saying that. That's plenty of analysts, such as Lance Zierlein, who's way more qualified than me, wrote an article about how it's the deepest position in this draft. And I think the Chargers wide receiver group is fine. I don't think that you need to take a Jalen Waddle to suffice. We saw what Justin Herbert did with his weapons this year, and I think you could take someone like Tutu Atwell in the fourth round, or some of the receivers that are going to be available on day 2 or day 3 to suffice. And that's just my opinion. I don't think that you need to take a Jalen Waddle or Devonta Smith, even if they are ranked as the highest players on the board at that point. Anyway, the Chargers play-by-play guy called my article a hot piece of fucking garbage. And that's what this video is about. But Matt Money Smith retweeted the article that Boltbeat posted, which is my article. And he talked about drafting great players over need. It's not a hard concept to digest. And Matt Money Smith is called my article horribly flawed. Wide receivers are deep in this draft. Draft for need, Telesco history, blah, blah, blah. If Slater or Sewell or Horn or Surtain are at 13 and then they are the highest rated guy on the board or close, take them. But if Darrisaw is ranked 25th and Waddle is ranked 5th, there's no discussion. So yeah, this started a firestorm in my mentions. I was actually walking outside and my phone was fucking buzzing because Matt Money Smith retweeted my article as people added me about it. But I have no ill will towards Matt Money Smith. If he didn't like my article, he didn't like my article. He wouldn't be the first person to not like my writing or podcasting, and he certainly won't be the last. And we'll probably have him on the show at some point in the future, and I'll get to debate him on it. I don't know. But this does get to a more quintessential point, and this is the topic of the episode, is best player available versus position of need, which is a better philosophy, and what should the Chargers do in this draft? So for me, I thought it was important to go back to what the Chargers have done in the past, right? Obviously, you look at their most recent drafts. You can look at last year's draft. Justin Herbert was the pick at number 6. And to me, that is a position of need selection. Now, you can argue was the best player available at the position of need. But Tom Telesco also said on the Pat McAfee show a few days later, after the first round, that he would have taken Tua Tagovailoa had the Dolphins picked Herbert. And to me, that signifies that the Chargers were okay. And I don't blame them for this. I think this is a fine philosophy. If you have Burrow, Tua, and Herbert ranked around the same, then you would, take one of those 3 guys, right? It's not like he took Jordan Love at 6 as a massive reach. So to me, though, it was about filling the QB position, right? If you say that you would have been fine taking any of those other guys, that signifies to me it was a position of need pick. Obviously, the departure of Phillip Rivers fuels that. Now, Justin Herbert may have been the BPA at the position of need, but to me, that doesn't change the fact that it was a position of need selection. Now, to the credit of the best player available crowd, you have a selection like KJ Hill. KJ Hill was a 4th or 5th round receiver who fell to the 7th round, and then the Chargers snag him as kind of the steal of the draft. Now, unfortunately, the Chargers are kind of deep at the wide receiver to the point where KJ Hill didn't play a lot, but I still have high hopes for KJ Hill. I don't think he's going to be Keenan Allen like some fans expect, but I do still think he is going to be a good player. So, you do get value at that selection. A guy who's projected to go in the 4th or 5th round probably was higher on the Chargers board, and you get him in the 7th. That is BPA, as I would define it. And you can go through all these picks and kind of debate it. But my main point is the Chargers do both, right? Like, you do take best player available sometimes, and sometimes you take position of need. Sometimes you combine both philosophies, and that results in a pick like Justin Herbert, which to this point has worked out. But let's talk about the 2019 draft, because you have Jerry Tillery and Nasir Adderley, who I'm not going to necessarily argue are BPA. But then you have a player like Trey Pipkins. And if you're going to say Trey Pipkins was the consensus BPA at that selection, I'm not going to say I buy it because, he came from Sioux Falls. I remember the draft analysts at the time on the panel basically had no idea who he was. And, Trey Pipkins was not a guy that was expected to go as high as the 3rd round. Now, Tom Telesco, to his credit, has said, hey, Trey Pipkins is a project. We're working on him, right? And to me, I don't believe Trey Pipkins is a bad pick yet. I think that it hasn't come to fruition and that he still is a project. But you're going to have a hard time convincing me that Trey Pipkins was the consensus BPA at that point, as opposed to a guy that the Chargers interviewed, liked, and thought they had potential with, and then drafted. So to me, based on the fact that tackle was also a need at that point, like it is every year, they took Trey Pipkins. And I don't really have a lot against the pick, but I think that's one of the key Chargers picks in the last 3, 4, 5, really all of Telesco's tenure that proves that they're not always about best player available, and sometimes they're about filling position of need. And you can go through the Chargers drafts throughout time and talk about which players were BPA and which players were position of need. But to me, that's not really the point. I think that, you could go to 2015 and you could say Melvin Gordon, they traded up for him in the draft because they really liked him. And he was, to me, a position of need pick. Now, you can also argue he may have been best player available and that a team would have taken him, fairly soon afterward. But, for me, it's just kind of like the Chargers. Ryan Matthews didn't work out. They really didn't have a ground game. They needed a running back, and they addressed that early and gave up picks in the 2015 draft to be able to do that. So that's just kind of my thing on it. Maybe some people will disagree in the comments, but to me, while Melvin Gordon may have been best player available, he was also a significant position of need selection. So I would argue that he was more a position of need pick than, say, a value selection. But you can go through all these drafts and figure out which player was best player available, which pick was position of need. But I'm not really here to debate that. I'm here to debate the point that if you take a Jalen Waddle at 13, right, what do the Chargers do after that? And I sort of talked about it in my article that if you look at Tom Telesco's hit rates on cornerbacks and offensive linemen in the 2nd or 3rd rounds, you have players like Trey Pipkins, Dan Feeney, Forrest Lamp, Max Twerk. You have Craig Mager, right? Are some of the guys, Chris Watt, someone pointed out to me on Twitter, are some of the cornerbacks and offensive linemen that he's taken in the 2nd and 3rd rounds on day 2. Now, I would argue most of those picks have been misses to this point, with Dan Feeney and Forrest Lamp not reaching second contracts, and Trey Pipkins were still TBD on. Chris Watt obviously had some injuries, but didn't pan out to the player that he was supposed to be either. So if you're going to take Jalen Waddle at 13, you kind of need to be sure that you're going to nail your 2nd or 3rd round pick with a tackle, a corner, and some of the positions of need that you have, right? Because taking wide receiver in the 1st round is great. It helps spread the offense, but what are you going to do for the positions that may actually cost you the playoffs if you don't have enough depth, right? And so to me, and Matt Money Smith's response to my point when I said that was basically, well, if you don't trust Telesco to make the second or third round picks, why are you trusting him to make the first? And that gets into a hairy territory about whether I think Telesco should be the GM of the Chargers or not. But in general, my point was that you have a significantly higher chance of nailing a first round pick than you do nailing a later pick. Like, you were picking from a better player pool for one, and you were taking the talent from the top, right? That's just the reality. And most of Tom Telesco's really great picks in the draft, Derwin James, Joey Bosa, obviously, we think Justin Herbert's great so far. A lot of those picks have been in the first round. And, you look at Telesco's draft history after that, it's a mixed resume. I would say leaning towards kind of bad. But, you do also have some hits like Keenan Allen and players like that. So I don't think Tom Telesco is an incapable drafter by any means. I do think he is ultimately a decent GM. But this is the case for all GMs, not just Tom Telesco. You have a significantly higher chance of hitting on a first round pick than you do on your later picks. And that is why people like Steven and Tyler are very much on the OT at 13 train, right? Where you take your offensive tackle at 13, figure out the rest later. Because they believe in players like Christian Darrisaw, they believe in players like Tevin Jenkins, they believe in a player like Rashawn Slater if he is there. And they all have them, kind of graded similarly, or maybe in some cases above a Jalen Waddle. No, I'm not going to say I inherently agree with that, because for me, I'm more of an OT or CB, or, I have to see the board at that point to see what it is, to see what I want at 13. But that is kind of why I think so many people are focused on a position, because Tom Telesco hasn't done great later in the draft, and because it's really hard to do good later in the draft, because drafting is such an inexact process that, a lot of this talent is accumulated in the first round, and then there's a lot of mixed opinions on the guys that are after the top 15, the top 30 in the draft. So that was kind of my whole point. But I certainly get where, Matt Money Smith is coming from. I certainly get where fans are coming from in regards to best player available. I don't disagree with the philosophy, but I also agree that teams do both. They do best player available, they do position of need, and sometimes they take the best player available at the position of need, like the Chargers somewhat did with Justin Herbert in 2020. But that's kind of my argument and how I feel about it. Let me know what you guys think about this whole debate between me and Matt Money Smith in the comments below. What you think the Chargers should do in the first round. And I will see you next week on Bolt Breakdowns. As always, stay subscribed to the channel. We have a lot of great Patreon content coming your way with some of our new hirings that we've got, like Brad Kelly and Arjun Menon, and some of the plenty of other guys that will be coming down the pipeline. So stay tuned for that. And yeah, really excited for the draft coming up in 12 days. And I hope you all join us on our live stream. So see you guys next time.